So, all right, how does someone know if they can build their dream house? If you've started to figure this out and you've figured out the land that you want to go and you started to narrow it down and you found, say, just one parcel that you're pretty interested in, how does somebody know they can build their dream house there, and how do they know what rules they have to play by to get this built?
So the piece of land you're talking about there would be an undeveloped piece of land. If you're looking in a subdivision, you're going to know pretty quickly what you can and can't build there. Mm-hmm. So a vacant piece of land will have a certain set of rules surrounding it based on the jurisdiction that it's in. So is it in the county? Has it been annexed into a city or a town? What is the zoning? There's some basic rules. Obviously you can't build a residential property in a commercial zoned area. So you need to understand the basic rules and who's making those rules.
Okay, so if you're going on the raw land perspective, and how do you figure out what jurisdiction you're in from a county, a city, or a town perspective?
Yeah. So when you look at a piece of property, go online, the counties typically have really good data available to you online. You can pull something called the tax rolls and you can see who's assessing a mill levy on that property. And that'll give you a good idea of not only the service providers, but who's going to have an input on the rules of that property. And so who's making the rules, a county or a town? Again, on those tax rolls, you'll see a county name. If you see a city or a town, that means that property has been annexed into a town or a city.
Okay, and you touched on annexing, and annexing is oftentimes highlighted as a good thing, but I've also heard of negative connotations with that. So how do you know if your property, if you want to even, we've discussed if you can tell if it has been annexed, but how about if you want to try and apply to be annexed? Is that the right thing, the wrong thing? Do you have a different opinion on annexing?
It depends. What are your goals? So traditionally, a county is going to have less regulations on that piece of land than a city or a town. And so if you want, to have livestock and you want to do more of the homesteading, you're probably going to want to stay in the county. But there may be some benefits to annexing. Maybe you can tie into the water or the sewer lines and maybe there's some benefit there. So you just need to look at both sides, know what your goals are, and do an analysis.
Okay, that's fair. So we touched on zoning. We now know who the rule maker is, whether it's the county, the city, or the town. But from a zoning, help us understand what zoning is and the importance of zoning on laws on particular property.
Sure. So the basics of zoning is a piece of property in a residential, a commercial, or an industrial zoning. That jurisdiction is going to look at their larger community to make sure that it's planned appropriately now and in the future.
Can you share a real world example of where zoning played a critical role in decision-making process?
Yeah, so actually last year I listed a property in Fort Collins, 9 acres, and was in the county. It was under UR1, Urban Residential 1 zoning.
Okay.
I had people approach me that wanted to subdivide it. They wanted to put a wedding venue on there. And because of that zoning, it restricted what they could do. So there was no subdivision, there was no wedding venue. It was what it was. Mm-hmm. On the flip side of that, there's another piece of property, same situation in the county, 9 acres, but it's under a rural residential zoning. That one is able to be subdivided. Larimer County has, I think, 30 different zoning districts. So, we talked about residential, commercial, industrial. It's usually not that cut and dry.
Yeah.
When we're talking about 30 different zoning districts, you can understand that would get complicated in a hurry. But that piece of property, they are going through the subdivision process. They're in month 11 of that. So it's still long. They still are having to hire consultants and engineers to help them. But zoning absolutely plays a key role.
Okay. So from a custom home perspective, if zoning doesn't match what you want, so to speak, is it worth going through the zoning process and trying to rezone it? Or, in your take, having seen this a couple of times, is it better to pass?
I'd say you pass.
Yeah.
You know, again, this is where you want somebody who understands it to take a look at it with you, but typically that would be a pass.
Yeah. A lot of times zoning from that perspective is you can rezone if you're commercial and if you have a lot of money and a lot of time to kind of work through it, but on the residential side, it's a little tough.
That's right.
Fair enough. All right, so let's go into covenants and deed restrictions. Can you explain what those are?
So we talked about zoning being a kind of the baseline of rules. Covenants and deed restrictions would be the next layer of rules on a piece of property.
Okay.
So if we're talking about a subdivision, you probably can expect there's going to be covenants. If we're talking about a rural piece of property, typically you're not going to have covenants. There still might be, but typically you're not going to. Deed restrictions are really can be on any piece of property, and this is why you need to pay attention to the details of the transaction. I've got one right now that we came across a really interesting deed restriction from the 1800s. It's a ag zone piece of property in the county. And I think it comes from the Prohibition days, but basically there's a deed restriction that said you can't have any type of business where you're producing alcohol on the property. So it can be anything.
Yeah, something to watch out for. So how can a buyer find out if there are covenants or deed restrictions on their land?
So typically in the MLS, we can put documents like CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions to help people understand on the front end, are there covenants here, there are rules here that I don't want to abide by. You know, maybe you have an RV that you want to park, the covenants don't allow that. But typically you're going to find these when you pull a title commitment. And at this point in the process, you should have done an initial due diligence on the property. You think it's going to work, you go under contract, and now you start to get the details. You get a title commitment, and that's where you're going to see all of the covenants, the deed restrictions, and some other things that are recorded on the property.
And so who can pull a title commitment? I mean, that's a pretty specialized field from that perspective. Are you hiring a title company? Can a realtor do that? Who can actually access that information?
Well, some of us will pull initial, what we call an owner's and encumbrance report, an O&E, to find out who owns the property, what encumbrances are on the property. I like to do that on vacant land before I list it because we find a lot of interesting things on vacant land, especially related to maybe oil and gas issues, lis pendens that may be on the property. But at this point in time, yes, so you're under contract, you have a title company, they have a title plant that does the research, and they're gonna pull all of that information. A citizen, a consumer, you can pull that. It tends to be a little bit costly. Attorneys can do that as well, but it's a normal part of the transaction when you're under contract to buy a piece of property.
Okay, fair enough. So what are some common restrictions that can limit a buyer's ability to build?
I think the most common that we see, especially in subdivisions, would be builder restrictions. And so a lot of builders will partner with developers, and they obviously want to have the business in that subdivision, and so they can put a builder restriction. You know, you can only use ABC builder to build the property.
Yep.
Other common restrictions, like I mentioned, parking of boats and RVs, fencing types, heights. The other one that gets people can be the landscaping. So maybe the certain type of landscaping that you have to put in, or the timing of that has caught some people.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, I could speak a little bit to the deed restrictions on builders, being a builder, because I know that can trip people up on a regular basis. And I think it's something that people need to be aware of and looking at it, because typically a deed restriction with a builder specifically does speak to you can't build with anybody else other than that builder. And so people need to understand that from a negotiation perspective, and understanding what that limits you for on your choices and where that puts you on the negotiating side. I do think there's an easy way to get around it. A lot of times most builders will lift it if you offer them more money. To be completely honest, we've seen it time and time again, that if you offer them a little bit more money, they will usually lift it and then make people feel a little bit more comfortable. But buyer beware on that aspect, because deed restrictions are real, and builders get very specific about those. So.